Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today at the first Sejong Smart City Forum. It is my great honor to speak to you about the future of urban life after COVID, the rise of smart cities. As we think about the future, it is important that we consider it in two parts. First, what will the future of the city be like after COVID? And second, how will we get to smart cities? Let's begin first with the topic of the future of urban life after COVID. And it begins with a simple question. What is the future of the city now that we have gone through the coronavirus pandemic? To gauge the future, we can look back at the past, and we see that in the past year, technology saved the day, and much of that technology was already ascending. Many technologies that had seen increases in use over many years or multiple decades accelerated in their use during the COVID pandemic in 2020, and they remain very strong even now in 2021. These technologies fall into four major categories. First is remote work. Second is online education. Third is e-commerce, and fourth is telehealth. These four technologies really helped individuals and economies survive and in some ways thrive despite the challenges of pandemic. Every country experienced the developments in these three areas a little bit differently. But these four areas are critical for thinking about the future of urban life. And as Sejong is the pilot city for the Smart City program in Korea, it's important to consider these four areas and how they have already impacted people's lives in ways that may remain permanent fixtures of urban life and the future of smart cities. First, if we consider the remote work dynamic, it is important to see that the percentage of workers globally that worked remotely was significant. Allow me to cite data from the United States on this, not just because I am from the United States, but because the United States has published a lot of data on this topic. The percent of workers with advanced degrees who have been working remotely because of COVID have spent many months over the past year above 50%. And this represents the percent of workers who've been working remotely only because of the pandemic. It does not include the other 10 to 20% of workers with advanced education who were already working remotely not because of the pandemic. In other words, for something like 2/3 of people with advanced degrees in the United States who've been working, they've been working remotely for most of the past year. Even for people with only a college degree, the percentage working remotely because of COVID has been around or above 1/3. That also excludes the percent of workers who've been working remotely not because of COVID. So something like a slight majority of all Americans with bachelor's degrees have been working remotely in total over the past year, partially because of COVID and partially because they were already working remotely. This has had a significant impact in urban relocation trends, with smaller cities garnering bigger increases in population. Some people have now referred to these as Zoom towns instead of boom towns. If we see a more comprehensive embracing of remote life in Korea, this could easily make cities like Sejong an unintended hotbed of population growth and urban activity. While these percentages of remote workers are likely to go down in the months ahead, as the COVID pandemic becomes less of a top concern because of vaccinations, it is extremely unlikely that the percent of the labor force working remotely will ever again be as low as it was in 2019 before the pandemic. We expect similar things for online education. Just look at the growth of massive open online courses. There's been a rising trend that's been going on for a decade, and we know that online education increased drastically during the COVID pandemic. And this is something that we expect will remain a core part of life. In fact, even if the number of people who've been remotely going to college or high school or getting advanced degrees decreases in the years ahead, it will probably never be as low as it was in 2019 before COVID. Never again. COVID has completely changed people's desire to access these critical things like work and education. And that's going to remain true in the future and in smart cities of the future. Being able to absorb the populations of the future will be a challenge for many cities, but making sure that people can access things like work and education will be essential. Similarly, e-commerce is an area where there have been tremendous increases in recent years. Looking again at US data, we see that the level of e-commerce skyrocketed in 2020. And it too is unlikely to ever be as low again as it was on average in 2019. Even though there has been a slight decrease in the dollar value of e-commerce in the third quarter and fourth quarter of 2020 compared to the second quarter of 2020, the levels are likely to remain near the all-time highs and eclipse the 2020 records in the very near future. E-commerce is likely to remain permanently high, and that's likely to remain true for most economies around the world. As we think about the future of smart cities, a big piece of that is going to be making sure people can get what they need. Not just that they can work or be educated, but that they can get the physical goods they need to survive and to live. And this element of remote life is also likely to be a permanent fixture. The same thing is true, by the way, for telemedicine and telehealth as well. There has been a telehealth trend that had been slowly rising and is now likely to remain permanently high. Because of the ability to access all of these services, and in the case of e-commerce goods remotely, cities may be able to support more people. And that's a good thing, because part of the reason smart cities will become important is because of the increased number of people who may come to live in those cities and cities of all sizes. Sejong is not the biggest city in Korea, but Sejong is looking at this challenge, and it's important for every city to be looking at this challenge, because even though people may not move to the biggest cities in the future as readily as they did in the past, and some of that's because of COVID, people will still probably be moving to cities of some size. And if they move to smaller cities like Sejong in a large number, that could have a very rapid and significant impact on infrastructure. This is where smart cities could be critical, because the real estate prices in the biggest cities of most countries in the world are usually the most expensive. But if people want those amenities of cities, and they want on-demand services and conveniences and safety of being in cities, well, they're still probably going to move somewhere. And if they do, their destination cities will need to be able to absorb them. This brings me to the second part of my talk, which is focused on the rise of smart cities and thinking about what the challenges are. And this brings me to the second question of my talk, which is, what does the acceleration toward remote life and technological convenience mean for integrating technologies to foster the development of smart cities? In other words, all of this remote life that we've seen be rapidly adopted during and after COVID, what's that going to mean for smart cities? Well, before we go and dig too deeply on that, I'd like to share how the Futurist Institute defines smart cities. We define smart cities as cities that approach the challenges of the decades ahead with a futurist perspective, leveraging technology and data to improve and optimize resource allocation, infrastructure, and economic activity. So there are a few elements here that I think are really important. And as Sejong pushes forward as Korea's pilot smart city, it's important to keep in mind that the smart city piece isn't just about the technology, and it isn't just about the data, it isn't just about resources, it isn't just about infrastructure and government economics. It's about all of that stuff together. And this confluence of factors is what makes the development of smart cities both a complicated and simultaneously critical challenge. Part of the challenge is tied to demographic factors that are at play here and that are insurmountable. On a global basis, the population is likely to rise by around 2 billion by 2050 in less than 30 years. Plus, the urban population is set to rise during that period by 2 to 2.5 billion as well. In other words, we're going to have a lot more people on the planet. And maybe all of those new people and then some will be living in cities at the mid-century. Finally, there's a third critical piece to these future risks: limited resources. I often say that we inescapably live in a Rousseauian world where resource limitations are critical for the future. The truth is that there's only so much land, water, and other resources to go around. We don't have unlimited land, unlimited water, unlimited environmental assets. So we have to make sure that we efficiently use these assets, especially as the global population and urban populations rise. This is why using data and technology to maximize and optimize around the assets we do have is going to become so important. It's also why the Smart Cities Council has set their 3 core priorities for future urban living and smart cities as livability, workability, and sustainability. While these 3 goals are a solid framework for thinking about the preferred future of urban living in smart cities, I see a lot more moving pieces to the outlook and the prospects of smart cities. I see that there are driving factors and levers of opportunity, as well as important requirements. For the big driving factors of smart cities, I first think about convenience factors, like on-demand services, the remote ability to work, the remote education piece, the e-commerce, and all of those remote benefits. I think of the convenience that people will want. These are critical pieces of livability, but it's about more than just convenience. After all, remote work, education, e-commerce, those have become critical elements of life, and those conveniences are going to become increasingly essentials and more important in the future. The good news is that a lot of those technologies have existed for some time, and they have seen, as we've discussed, tremendous recent adoption. Plus, they may get better and accelerate over time. But most importantly, a lot of those technologies are already there. And that's really good because people have embraced convenience. Without that technological acceptance, without that affinity and recognition of the value of convenience, smart cities will have a tougher time gaining support and acceptance. Now, the second big factor driving development of smart cities may be what some people call sustainability. But rather than just thinking of it as sustainability, I prefer to describe this critical driver of smart cities as perceived abundance. By this phrase, I mean that it does not matter how much water or land or food people have in a city. They need to feel comfortable with those resources and their relative abundance or lack of scarcity. Populations of cities need to perceive that those utilities, that those natural resources are there no matter what. They need to feel that there's as much water as they need, as much power as they need, and they need to feel that it's abundant and plentiful. Now, that doesn't mean they shouldn't be encouraged to conserve. Of course, they should conserve. And that doesn't mean we don't need to conserve more, because of course we do. We should actively engage in conservation, focusing on sustainability. But most importantly, you don't want the population of growing cities to feel like they can't rely on water, they can't rely on power, or that they're living somewhere impoverished. So you want people to feel that there is abundance in resources. And again, that's not necessarily wealth or money, but the physical things that people actually need, the necessities, the food, water, power, and shelter. Regardless of actual scarcity, the goal of smart cities should help to stretch those resources and actively foster perceived abundance. Finally, there's a third driving factor, which I think is also very important, and that's safety. This includes everything from feeling there's food safety, there's water safety, and there's available shelter, and the people have enough places to live, but it's also about cybersecurity. After all, we've got all this data, we've got all this technology of smart cities, and people also need to feel safe around that. Plus, there are also contactless technologies. Especially in the wake of COVID, those are going to become more important. There are a lot of different safety pieces in there, but they all matter. While I know some people just invoke the three elements of the Smart City Council to define the future as livability, workability, sustainability, I believe there's a lot more at play here for the future of cities. And while I think of the priorities and the driving factors of smart city development as convenience, perceived abundance, and safety, we also need to talk about the levers of opportunity that can get us there. I mean, what levers and technologies can help us take cities to smart cities? In my opinion, there are a few different kinds of levers of opportunity worthy of discussion. And the first thing really is data. Now we have the ability now to collect and analyze data to a level that has previously just never existed in our history. From storage to processing power and emerging AI, let alone future AI and IoT, that data is going to help us derive value and insights in order to make good decisions that inform smart city operations. That also includes, of course, data access to things like open data platforms. That's going to play an important role in smart cities. But so will a culture of data, which I'll talk about in a minute and which is also critical for smart city development. There are other important levers of opportunity as well, other technological necessities that are going to be critical levers and conditio sine qua non of smart city development. These include especially automation and self-driving vehicles. These will be absolutely critical, not just for the abundance and the convenience factors of smart cities, but for managing just the sheer volume of people who may be moving to cities against a backdrop of limited infrastructure, with needs to track and influence traffic patterns and allocate limited infrastructure in ways more efficient than most current infrastructure and road systems can. This is something we're probably only going to achieve when we get to a much more sophisticated AI system and automated fleet vehicles. When we get to those self-driving vehicles and automation technologies, we'll be wedding those physical technologies with AI and all the data that feeds into AI. Beyond the transport infrastructure, we're also going to need to lever data and opportunity with smart utilities and resource allocations. This is where we're going to need to have a very ecological and energy efficient optimized mindset and a way of approaching resource utilization that is going to address risks of limited supplies while engendering perceived resource abundance and security. But this is going to be a potentially Herculean challenge that will require some significant investments. We're going to see that data presents some of the opportunity for us to do more with the assets than we already have. We already have the assets. We can do more with them with data. But there will also be some significant financial investments, especially for some cities with older infrastructure. That will be required. Finally, there is a lever of opportunity, something I've already talked extensively about, so I'm not going to talk too much about it here. It's this remote life and how everyone is moving towards a more remote environment. The acceptance and embracing of remote life will be a cornerstone element of smart cities. And fortunately, we're largely there or on our way in many respects. As part and parcel of the future of smart cities, we do, however, need to discuss the important requirements that get us there. I've already talked about some of these, but the most important requirements don't necessarily require as much money as you would think. There are things that do require financial investments like infrastructure And those investments depend very much on the age of a city and the age of the infrastructure. But some of the most important requirements are political will and societal acceptance. When it comes to smart city development and societal or strategic requirements, for example, I see embracing technology as a critical requirement. Fortunately, in the wake of COVID, people seem more willing to embrace technology than ever before. I know Sejong has the youngest average population of any city in Korea, and that's going to be a big positive. It's also true that coming out of COVID-19, despite the horrific nature of the pandemic, embracing technology and remote life is something that's already widespread, and it will be helpful for pushing smart city development. A second requirement for smart city development that's a bit more difficult is the culture of data. Simply put, it's one thing to collect a lot of data, but it's another thing to actually be thinking about data all the time and how to embrace data and how data can bring value when we utilize data in the right ways. This is going to be a critical element of smart city development. And for many organizations, it's not that easy to achieve. Next on the list is long-term strategic planning. I think we all know that not all people working in cities, governments, or businesses take long-term approaches to strategic problems. Very often, short-term decisions that are made can have long-term consequences, but the priorities aren't set right. This is why setting those right long-term strategic priorities can be critical. And if we think about the culture of data, integrating that with those strategic priorities can help smart cities be successful. Futurist thinking is another piece that doesn't require the same investment as new pipes and roads and bridges, but it's significant. Futurist thinking is about strategically laying out scenarios for different future eventualities and preparing for multiple potential futures, rather than just being tied to only one potential outcome. In short, it's about having the flexibility of mind to prepare for multiple potential scenarios. When it comes to smart cities, that's going to be important. After all, you don't want the people working on planning the future tied to just one potential future. Technologies will expand and accelerate. All of the businesses working on these issues, the governments and public-private partnerships need to be agile in the face of an evolving future, with all of the opportunities and risks that entails. Because the technologies we have are evolving and society is evolving, all of that is going to be part of a critical set of dynamics going forward. This is why thinking like a futurist, being prepared for multiple scenarios, and having that flexibility and agility of mind will be increasingly really important. Next on the list is the energy and eco-efficient requirement. This is where there needs to be an embracing of the resource optimization and efficiency and making the best decisions possible to make sure that resources can stretch further and that eco-friendly substitutions and augmentations can be adopted. We need to think about energy and the overall environmental footprint of increasingly dense urban environments in a way that we're confident we're making the right decisions to manage both more urban environments and more dense environments. And more dense urban environments, of course. Another requirement, of course, is government support. In many respects, smart city development just doesn't work if you don't have the support of the local government, as well as public-private partnerships to foster and nurture smart city development. Finally, and this is really what one of the most important areas where the government's probably likely to come in is, the supporting of infrastructure investments. If all the roads need new sensors, if new power energy infrastructure needs to be built, or if other infrastructure needs to be built or upgraded, government involvement will be critical, from regulation to funding. And of course, not all cities will face the same challenges. As you may know, I live in Texas, and we just had the worst winter storm in our entire history. Our statewide power grid was minutes away from failure, and many people were without power for several days in a winter storm with freezing temperatures. The water system was in even worse shape, and that left people in major cities like Austin, the city where I live, which is also the second most important technology city in the United States, completely without any running water for almost a week. This is because some of our water system included cast iron pipes from the 1930s. I mention this because different cities have different infrastructure assets. Some are newer and some are older. But if infrastructure upgrades are needed, they can be significant. And if we're committing to smart cities, we need to know that these investments may lie ahead. There might need to be some government support, incentivizing private investments as well. You may disagree with me about what I expect for the future of smart cities, but we're unlikely to disagree about the fact that companies respond to financial, tax, and government incentives. As such, if a certain outcome is desired, there needs to be some incentive for that outcome to happen, and there needs to be an acceptance of trade-offs that are accepted along the way to the intended goal, in this case, smart cities. Now, as we think about these driving factors, levers of opportunity, and the requirements that get us to smart cities, I think it's also really important that we think about what the implications of all of this are. All right, so first up, there's going to be technology everywhere. And I normally think and feel like there's technology everywhere right now, but I suspect 30 years from now, when we look at how much technology is in our cities, we will look back at this time in 2021 and think how absolutely primitive our medieval our cities were. Simply because we did not have the amount of technology today, the abundance of technology that they will have 30 years from now. I also think we're going to have sensors everywhere. I mean, we're going to need sensors measuring everything. There will also be data collection on everything in order to ensure that the technology optimized resource and infrastructure allocations and decisions are efficient. And of course, for any data system to yield the highest value and most optimized outcomes, good data and a lot of good data will be required. The system will require almost infinite good and valid inputs. And the longer the time series of inputs, the better. As such, the sooner we put sensors on everything and start collecting the data, the more inputs the system will have. And the sooner our smart cities will be able to think for themselves, informed by data, derived from sensors, and powered by AI. There are also other things that I've talked about and that I think are important implications. One is the government support that's required, as well as the physical infrastructure demands that might be critical to help bring smart cities to fruition. And then there's one final implication that I haven't yet talked about, but I think it's really important, especially for Korea. This is the fact that all of this push to smart cities globally, not just in Korea, but on a global basis, will result in significant increased ICT demand, as well as investment in the ICT space. In short, ICT could get a lot hotter because because of all of these increased demands on ICT from smart city development. I mean, it doesn't happen without the data, without the sensors, without the tech, without the computers, without the AI. All of that means ICT becomes important. And if we look at the global ICT market, as well as Korean trends in ICT, they've been going up. Plus, our forecasts are that they're going to go up further. The Korean ICT market is about 10% of global ICT, and that's a sizable chunk of a growing market, which will grow the industry trillions of Korean won in the years ahead. It's going to be big. So, how about that? I leave you with the not necessarily optimistic, but realistic expectation that there will be a lot of opportunities for ICT companies and for smart cities, as well as for the businesses, governments, and people that embrace the future of smart cities. There will be a lot of opportunities, and I think this means that opportunities will abound for Sejong and for Korea, not just because of the strength in ICT industries, but because of the importance of the pilot program we see in the Sejong Smart City pilot program. I thank you again for having me here today to speak to you. It has been my tremendous honor. Thank you.